Today is the last in our series on awkward conversations. In some ways, perhaps in many ways, this is the sermon to which all the others have built. We're going to finish talking about awkward conversations. When we started planning this sermon series a few months ago, I got to be honest, none of us really thought that things were going to be this disjointed, this unharmonious in the broader world as they are right now. And so while we totally did not cause any of the political and social conversations, we're going to talk about them. We're going to talk about what we can do about them, and we're going to actually wrap up that series about them today. They've given us plenty of fodder for our series on awkward conversations. So far, we've looked at disagreement. On the first day of the new year, January 1st, Austin talked about how God calls us to go beyond our boundaries, to love people that don't look like us and act like us. He talked about Jesus and the Samaritan woman and the disciples and how God breaks down the boundaries between people. We're called to love people that aren't our people. We talked about confrontation. How God calls us sometimes to confront people, but to do it with grace and truth. We talked about disposition and how we can cultivate that Christian disposition that's able to respond when we're attacked without getting angry and lashing back out. We talked about the most awkward of conversations for many of us, and that's sharing our faith. And something that's really tough for a lot of us to do, but also we see value in doing. How can we do that with joy instead of judgment, with hope instead of hate? Today we're going to ask one final question. We're going to dive into a question that might be the biggest of all these questions, and that's what might we say as a people of faith, as a body of Christians, what might we say to the broader world? What might we say to a world that has lost its temper or perhaps even lost its mind? See, it's one thing for us not to be hateful people, and that's good. It's one thing for us not to be hurtful and angry and violent, not to engage in awkward conversations ourselves. That's a good start, and I love that, and I encourage that. But the reality is there are people that are still caught in the midst of this giant worldwide awkward conversation full of anger. What do we say as Christians, as people of faith? What do we say to bring hope to them? So, as I was working on this sermon and thinking about this conversation and this question, I was reminded of a conversation that took place that I was part of in 2008. It's a conversation that sticks to me to this day, even though it's, almost a decade old at this point. It was a conversation in 2008 on November 27th in the wake of the Mumbai terror attacks. I was part of a group that gathered in the midst of a terrorist event to pray for those who had lost their lives, those who were hurt, those who were injured, those who were scared. The Mumbai attacks were 4 days long. They were bombings and shootings. They tore through Mumbai, India. They killed 164. They wounded 308. I remember being a junior in college at the time. And I remember participating in this gathering of people of all different faiths as we came together with one specific purpose: pray for faith. There were people of all different faiths out there, and so many were Christian, but we also had Hindus and Muslims, Jews and Buddhists, people with diverse beliefs with one united goal: pray for peace. And it was in the middle of that gathering that the news began to break that these attacks had been perpetrated by members of one religious faith, and that they'd targeted members of another faith, both of which were represented in our gathering. And I watched as people began to turn on each other, as people began to look at those with whom they had previously been praying and say, how could your people do this to my people? I watched as the harmony and the peace that we were seeking and that we were experiencing broke down into anger and hatred and chaos. And I watched almost like from the sidelines. See, the attacks weren't perpetrated by Christians. They weren't specifically targeting Christians. As a Christian, I was just kind of an observer, a bystander. But I watched as one group turned angry and one group turned scared, and they began to accuse and attack. I watched with a profound sense of loss as something so beautiful became overrun by chaos. And there I was, caught in the middle. I know some of you are feeling that way this week. I logged on to Facebook on Friday, and that alone was a mistake. And I watched as it seemed like the world went mad. as people began to state their opinions on big political issues, and that I agree with, but what sometimes saddened me was the anger with which it was done, the hatred. I saw people quote the Bible, but do so in ways that aren't quite biblical. I saw the tone turn to fury. I saw people, even when they were right, say things in such a hurtful and angry way that those they disagree with had no chance of listening. And I'm going to go off script here for a second. Because at the same time, I noticed that not a single one of those hateful, angry messages came from this church. And I'm grateful for y'all. I saw lots of hate out there this week, but I didn't see any of it coming from you. And I don't say that to brag on you. I say that because I'm grateful for you. I saw many of you respond to some of the anger out in the world and to do so with truth and grace. And I am grateful for the way that you did that. Thank you for setting a message of what conversation can look like. All right. But I don't think that takes away from the fact that there was anger out there. And so as I and many of you sat and watched the world tear itself apart, I had a simple question running through my head. Do I step into this conversation? Dare I step into this conversation? Must I step into this conversation? Because if I do, there I'm going to be caught in the middle. I'm sure some of you had the same feelings, and I'm sure some of you have wrestled with those, not just on political conversations, but at every level of our life. Parents, this is what you experience when you come home and the kids are yelling at each other and he said this and she did that and it's her fault, it's his fault. The other one always started it, and you've got to figure out, what do I do in the middle of these two kids? I got to be honest, that probably doesn't end when your kids reach a certain age. I think my parents might attest that adult kids still get there sometimes too, right? Sometimes we get caught in the middle. Sometimes it's with our friends, and our friends get angry with each other, and there's something that causes them to turn on each other, and one friend yells at another friend, and another friend gets even, and then suddenly they look to pull us into the middle of it and want us to pick a side in the midst of it, and somehow being caught in the crossfire seems like we take more hits from both sides. We end up the most hurt. We didn't cause it, we're not the target of it, but the chaos is there, and we're caught in the middle of it anyways. So what do we do about it? This is something that we experience as a church. I think a little bit uniquely as a church, though all churches might experience this to some degree, but it seems to hit hardest here. See, some of you know I love this aspect of our church. We're a very diverse church on pretty much any spectrum that you could choose. Politics, social issues, anything that you can choose out there, we have a lot of different opinions. We have people who are staunchly on the left side of most political issues, people who are staunchly on the right side of most political issues, and people who are everywhere in the middle. And sometimes that means as a church, it feels like we're getting pulled from both sides. Like we're right in the middle of a tug of war, and we're taking it even harder. Sometimes as a church, it feels like we're the ones caught in the middle. So what do? Today we only read one verse. It's Matthew 5:9. It's from the Beatitudes. It's a verse that many of you have heard before. This verse comes from a teaching of Jesus that we call the Sermon on the Mount. It's the longest contiguous sermon that we have of Jesus, the longest piece of Jesus' teaching, and it's very, very important to us as Christians. It's 3 chapters long. It's 30% of the whole content of the Gospel of Matthew. It has some of our most important and most beloved teachings. The Lord's Prayer we take from the Sermon on the Mount. And right in the middle of that sermon is this little passage, this little section called the Beatitudes. They're Jesus' sayings where he says, "Blessed are because this." These Beatitudes have become the backbone of how Christians believe God is calling us to treat other people. Whether or not you grew up in church, you've probably heard of at least a few of these. Let's try it out. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. This is what Jesus is telling us. Children of God, caught in the middle, called to be peacemakers. Now, this verse has been taken a couple different ways. So we're going to look at what it means to be a peacemaker in a world that needs it. It doesn't mean that we sit back and hope for peace. Now, the church has done that at times. In the middle and early parts of last century, the church built all these enclaves and institutions and universities in small towns away from the front lines of the social and political divides of its day. See, when the world was raged by questions over segregation or prohibition or women's liberation or all of these different political issues, there were times where the church bounced back a little bit, took a step back, tried to find a peaceful place far away from the front lines and retreated to the margins. This is part of the reason that there's so many incredible, awesome Christian institutions and universities in towns under 5,000. It was safe. It's a trend we saw in the monastics in the early church as they looked at a world that seemed to have lost its mind in early Roman days, and they decided to move to the deserts to form monasteries. It's a trend that honestly I see in myself at times as I watch some of the conversations happen around us, and sometimes I choose to take a step back to where it's safe and where there's peace, rather than a step forward where it's scary. Is that what we are called to do? Are we people who find peace by escaping the storm? When we see injustice threatening the lives of others, does our faith really call us to run? When we see broken systems that cause inordinate amounts of pain towards the most disenfranchised groups, whether they be African Americans in the urban core or blue-collar workers in the Rust Belt, when we see that the most vulnerable in our society experience the least amount of peace, when safety comes not through justice but through power, are we called, are we allowed to step back in a hope for peace rather than into the fearful front? Do we really find peace by closing our eyes? And if we close our eyes, will we ever find peace? Jesus does not call us peace wanters. Children of God caught in the middle are called to be peacemakers. We may not be merely longing for peace, but neither are we called to force it. It's tempting to go the other direction. This might have been the way that some would have read this passage in the ancient world. The word peacemakers in Greek was a bit uncommon. It was really only used in one context in ancient Rome, and it was used for a group of emperors who had brought peace to the Roman Empire. A group of emperors who left the Roman Empire in peace for 206 years, the famous Pax Romana, Roman peace. The emperors were the peacemakers, except it wasn't a very peaceful peace. See, Rome still sent vast armies to crush any threat from the outside. Even within the Roman Empire, any dissent was met with force. It was peace, but peace through threats and violence and intolerance. It was Roman peace that killed Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace. Is this what we're called to? At times, the institutional church has sought to follow this. I don't need to tell you about the Inquisition, the Crusades. I don't need to tell you about the times that you've seen people in the name of Christ yell and scream and condemn and hate others. Times that we try to force peace by yelling the loudest. Are we called to be peace forcers? So what's our option? What's our alternative? Children of God caught in the middle, called to be peacemakers. What does that really mean? Well, let's start with the word that Jesus uses for peacemakers. It's irene poiepoi. It's Greek. We translate it as peacemakers because that's the direct translation. Irene is peace, but not just peace in the absence of violence. It's not just peace like things are quiet for a second. It's peace like completion. Peace like wholeness. Peace that comes when everything that God made is in the place where God wanted it to be, and every person that God loves, which is all of us, by the way, is living the life that God hoped for them to live. Peace. The Hebrew word is shalom. Poiepe, poiepoi. Makers, builders, creators, doers. It is impossible in the Greek language to construct poiepoi in a passive way. Peacemakers is not something we can long for. It's something that must be strived after. This is not peace longers or peace lovers, peace hopers or peacekeepers. Those are all good things. They're just not what Jesus is talking about. He says, be peacemakers. Do peace. Construct peace. Build peace. Make peace. Bring peace. The more I study this, the more I realize that I think this might be what Christ has in store for us. As a church worldwide, nationwide, earth-wide, history-wide, but also here as a church, Tonganoxie United Methodist Church, to be peacemakers. See, we're caught with a foot in both sides of most political divides. We're caught sometimes in what feels like the eye of the storm. But are we caught in the midst of the storm? Or are we placed there? Are we trapped in the midst of a big divide, or are we exactly where we need to be? I don't believe that we're called to live in fear that hate might disturb our hope. I believe that we're called to live so that our hope might break the chains of hate. Nothing convinces me of this as much as reading the stories of Jesus, watching him in action as he brings peace into action. Jesus' world was just as divided as ours. He had Pharisees and Sadducees, centurions and Herodians, all these different political entities that would try to trap him and trick him. They would bring questions to him and a chance to destroy him. And Jesus uses truth to see through their tricks, but he always seems to stop short of falling into hate. His actions are a little bit different than what we might see in our modern world. See, in our modern world, when we see facts, real facts, most often they're wielded as weapons against the other side to destroy the other side. And when we see mercy, real mercy, it's often only for the people that look like us and act like us and think and speak and believe like us. It's hard to imagine Jesus in the midst of that awkward conversation. But I want to imagine that today, because I think we need that today. We're at a time in American history that's been as divided as any historical period since the Civil Rights Movement. Things are pretty tough right now. And so I want to look at another story from another divided time that might help us in our own time. This is James Lawson. He's a United Methodist pastor from Memphis, Tennessee. He's a retired United Methodist pastor now, but you never really retire. You just kind of slow down and keep different hours. James Lawson is a pastor in Memphis, Tennessee. He's an incredible guy. He's the pastor that was friends with another man named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. See, his heyday was 40 years ago, when it was a pretty interesting time to be pastor, when it was a pretty interesting time to be black, when it was a pretty interesting time to be in the South, and James Lawson was all of those three. Because of his friend, Dr. King, he was involved in many of the biggest debates of his own day. They didn't have an immigration debate, but they had one on segregation. They had separate but equal, and questions of is it either. There was a literal separation at that time, and the church caught itself in the middle of it. There were probably no greater sources of conflict than in the church. Dr. King once famously said that the most segregated hour in America was Sunday morning. And that was true. As a church, we ran right through the middle of that. There were racist United Methodist churches and racist United Methodists. It's not something that we say with pride, but we will be humble and admit our faults. There were activist United Methodist churches and many churches that still proudly talk about their founder or their leader and their role in bringing peace and justice. And in the middle of these two, there were people that were a whole nother level of cool. James Lawson was one of them. James Lawson was the one who invited his friend Dr. King to Memphis to lead the strike of African American sanitation workers as they struggled for equal treatment. He was the one who brought his friend to Memphis, and it was in Memphis that Dr. King gave his famous speech, "I've been to the mountaintop," on April 3rd. And it was in Memphis, sitting on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel the following evening, that Dr. King was shot and killed by James Earl Ray. I can't imagine what must have been going through the mind of James Lawson at this moment. The loss of a friend, the loss of a hero, the loss of a leader, the loss of a man who died in the place where you invited him to come. I wonder if there was temptation to rise in hatred, as so many did in the days after King's assassination. Temptation to shout louder, temptation to respond with anger, temptation to ignore the pain of others and be drowned out in his own. But Lawson isn't quite like that. I actually wanted you to hear in his own words a little bit of his message.
Martin King would have gone to visit him. I knew this.
United Methodist pastor and activist James Lawson lost his close friend Martin Luther King in 1968 to an assassin's bullet. When James Earl Ray was named as King's murderer, Lawson wanted to model love, not hate.
I started visiting with him simply and tried to befriend him. The motivation was simple. I did not see it as something apart from the love of God or the love of Jesus.
Over years of prison visits and getting to know the accused, Lawson formed his own opinion. Lawson became the hated man's pastor. He recalls a phone call from Ray's girlfriend Anna one night, which interrupted a family dinner and spurred him to action.
She said that James and I want to be married. We want you to do it. I turned around and sat back at the table, and our oldest boy, John, I asked the question, should I marry James or Ray in prison? And John said, if you believe that stuff you preach, you'll do it. So what could I say about that?
Lawson performed the prison wedding in 1978, and 20 years later, visited the inmate on his deathbed.
I spent an afternoon with him when he was very, very ill. And he died a few days after that. And of course, he let me know he wanted me to do his service, which I agreed to do. I knew that I had to carry on a ministry in the spirit of Martin King, but most of my nonviolent participation in practice is out of the sense of the presence of God and the Spirit of God, with Jesus as a major teacher. That's still my guideline. That's still the path of reflection that I take.
How much love does it take to do the wedding and the funeral, the counseling of the killer of your friend? How much peace does it bring when we live with that love? We claim and are called children of God. May our lives be worthy of such a name. It's tempting at times to shout loud, but I believe that Christ calls and models and invites us to listen hard. We're tempted to ignore others' pain out of our own, but I think we are called to rise up and heal the hurting. We are tempted to say this is not our fight, that we are merely trapped in the middle. But I wonder if instead we are called to say that we are perfectly placed here to bring peace to the world around us. See, we're a church and we're a people that have a foot in the right and a foot in the left. We are pulled by both sides. And it's tough to be the tug of war. But I think that also means that we have a voice with both sides. That we have a chance to show to both sides that this is what it means to love peace. That when both sides pull us their direction, we might instead pull them to the one who has brought enough love and grace and strength to unify us. That we might remind them that there is a love that trumps hate, and a love that can lead one man to become the pastor for the guy who killed his best friend. Peacemaking is hard. It's the hardest thing you'll ever do. You can only make peace with your enemies, which means it requires that you engage with them. But peacemaking isn't really an option for children of God. We're not allowed to sit by passively and hope that somebody else makes justice happen. We're not really given the option to turn a blind eye and pretend that it's not our fault, and therefore it's not our fight. We're caught in the middle, and that's tough, and that's rough. But it also makes me wonder, are we caught in the middle of the chaos, or are we perfectly placed to bring peace from right where we are? Let's pray.